Funding for Amish Cooking from Quilt Country with Marcia Adams was provided by
Sauter Woodworking, America's furniture craftsman.
And by Marilat Industries, America's cabinet maker, committed to quality and a variety of kitchen and bath cabinetry styles.
Hi there, and welcome to Amish Cooking from Quilt Country. Baking with yeast is a deep-seated tradition with the Amish and Mennonites, and the Mennonite cookbooks are filled with all sorts of variations of breads, rolls, coffee cakes, and even raised muffins. When these people first came to Pennsylvania, they constructed outdoor bake ovens to make their wonderful baked goods, just as they had used in the Rhineland. And you'll still find examples of these old ovens on some back roads in Pennsylvania. They look like sort of oval brick ovens, and you have no trouble telling that they're ovens. And they are shaped like a bee's skep that you find in herb gardens. They were very important for bread making because they were able to achieve the proper temperature for the bread. After they baked the bread, they pulled that out and they put in their pies and cakes. The fire was a little bit lower, and they finished up drying out the noodles in those ovens. So you see, they were important to their good quality breads. Actually, though, the first recipe we're going to make today is not a yeast bread. It's called German onion cake, and it's not a cake. Nonetheless, it's irresistible. What it is an enormous soft biscuit topped with sauteed onions, sour cream, and poppy seed, and it absolutely melts in your mouth. We have updated the recipe for today's kitchen, and I'm doing it in a food processor. And we start with 2 cups of flour, and to that we're going to add 1/4 of a cup of cornstarch. Now when you see cornstarch in a recipe, that gives you 2 clues. Number 1, it might be a very old recipe, and it's inclined to be. And number 2, you will have a very smooth end product. And then we're going to add 4 teaspoons of baking powder and 3/4 teaspoon of salt. And then we're just going to pulse that mix. When I say pulse, and that's spelled P-U-L-S-E in case you don't understand me, that means you're simply mixing this one time on this pulse button. To that, we're going to add 5 tablespoons of white vegetable shortening. And we're going to pulse that perhaps 2 or 3 times until coarse crumbs are formed, much like you would have for a pie crust. And then add to that 3/4 to 1 cup of milk and make a stiff batter. That didn't take long. Isn't that wonderful? I want to turn on the onions and explain those to you a bit. Here we have 2 cups of very coarse onions that have been sauteed in 2 tablespoons of butter. Now don't rush this. It'll take 15 to 20 minutes. You want the onions golden and limp, as some recipes say. I think that's sort of a gross word to use in relationship to cooking, but you see that. And then to that add 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 teaspoon of pepper, and 1/2 teaspoon of marjoram. Marjoram is a herb that's associated with Germans, and so it's very appropriate to use it in this dish. They also use it in their stuffed goose recipes. Then we're going to dump this out into a 10-inch greased cake pan, hence its name, onion cake, and smooth it out. I want to go back to the ovens a bit. Even though the Midwestern Pennsylvania Dutch, Amish/Mennonite people, did not have the outdoor ovens, and the reason is because they came here after 1848, and by that time the black ovens that you have seen in your grandmother's kitchen were in vogue. So really they had it much easier than the Pennsylvania Dutch people did. But in Pennsylvania, but the early Midwest cooks did have 2 kitchens, and one was used primarily for the summer preparation of canned goods and for weekly baking, leaving the main kitchen free for the preparation of daily meals. And even today yet, the Amish in Indiana at least have 2 kitchens, a winter kitchen and a summer kitchen. Now, dollop these sauteed onions right on top. Clear the edge, because you want every bite of this to be good. Then, over the top, drizzle 3/4 cup of sour cream that has been mixed with a beaten egg. This is going to make sort of a frosting, a heavenly frosting. And over the top of that, 2 teaspoons of poppy seed. Wow, I got it all in one blob. I shall take care of that by using my fingers. And drift paprika over the top. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees. That's important that ovens be preheated. And I'll tell you that in all my recipes that you see on the show, you start with preheated ovens. Put this in a 450-degree oven and bake it for 20 minutes. Isn't this marvelous looking? German onion cake, an unusual recipe, one of the most unusual in the book actually. Use it as a quick bread for any meal. The texture is as finely grained as a very good cake. Cut it in wedges and serve it warm. It also microwaves well. This next recipe is an Amish dressing, which is similar to a poultry stuffing. And I had a woman call me from California who'd been to the Indiana Amish country and bought this dressing at a restaurant in bulk to freeze, and she took it back with her to California on the plane. She told me it tasted exactly the same as this recipe I'm going to show you, and she was thrilled that she could now make it herself in her own California kitchen. Begin with 4 quarts of toasted bread cubes, and use a very good quality bread, none of that puffy commercial stuff. The Amish, of course, would use their own homemade bread that was left over. And to this, we're going to add 2 cups of coarsely shredded cooked chicken. Already you see this is going to be a bit different. 1 1/4 cups of cold cooked potatoes that have been cut up in little pieces. You can see the size of the pieces. 1 cup of shredded carrots, a cup of finely chopped celery, a cup of onion, and a 1/2 cup of parsley. Isn't this pretty? So pretty. And then these great spices, because it makes a wonderful combination. We have a tablespoon of sage, a tablespoon of celery seed, a teaspoon of, let me see, thyme, pepper, and turmeric. We use turmeric in Indiana instead of saffron, and probably the reason is Indiana has never had the rich farmland that the Pennsylvania people had, and saffron is a very expensive herb, and the Indiana people simply wouldn't have been able to afford it. Now mix this up with your hands because that's quicker. God made hands before he made spoons, so I never have any compunctions about using my hands in cookery. Wash them first, of course. Here we have 5 beaten eggs, and to that add a big can of evaporated milk and 2 cups and a half of good rich chicken broth. And of course here we make that from scratch. Pour this over the top. At this point, the dressing is going to look really sort of soppy because you see you're going to see the milk down in there, and that's going to worry you. Not to worry. You're going to let this dressing set aside for 1 hour, and then you can either bake it or freeze it. Now, this can be frozen 2 ways. You can put it in a quart jar, so you can put it actually in the pans that you're going to use. I like to put it in 9x13 flat Pyrexes, or I will actually put it in a very deep casserole because I think it's soft and puffier that way. I don't know why ovens don't automatically close by themselves, but here's the dressing. It's been in a 2-quart casserole, and it has baked at 350 degrees for 2 hours. Isn't that extraordinarily good? This is a hearty side dish that the Amish call filling. I especially like this because it's colorful. Serve it with fried chicken and gravy. Now that's good eating. I really think that everyone ought to know how to make baking powder biscuits, because by using biscuits with a menu, you can flesh out this simple list of ingredients and dishes and bring it the whole meal to a point of elegance. Now, the recipe book calls for a very enormous recipe, but I'm only going to use a half a recipe today, and I will give you the ingredients and the amounts as we go. We start with 3 cups of flour in the food processor bowl, and we're going to add 1/4 cup instant non-fat dry milk powder. This is a good product to keep on hand. You buy it in a box at the grocery market, put it on your pantry shelf. If you run out of milk, you can reconstitute this with water. Now, it does not have a marvelous taste, but it gets you by for cooking. And it's better than, say, having to go to the grocery store and buy it, or hitch up the buggy and go buy milk, or to go to the barn and milk a cow. And then to this, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of baking powder, which tells you these are really going to puff up, and 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar, a teaspoon of salt, and 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar. And then add 1/2 cup of cold, and the cold is important, butter chunks, and 1/2 cup lard. Now, do not recoil in horror when you see me add this lard. Lard only has 1/2 of the saturated fat as butter. And how many of you know what really know what lard is? It is rendered pork fat, just as chicken fat rendered out is called schmaltz. The Jewish use a lot of that. Now pulse this together again so you're making crumbs like you did in the onion cake. The liquid we're using today is 1/2 cup of buttermilk plus 6 tablespoons of buttermilk. And pulse that until you have a stiff batter. Now you can see how easy this is for me, but the Amish would probably make it either with 2 knives or they would use this old-fashioned pastry blender, which incidentally I do like. Let's see how this is going. Oh, I think I can roll that out pretty well. I'm going to put it over here on my floured cloth. I like working with a floured cloth. That was the way I was taught by my mother, incidentally. People often ask me the difference between all-purpose flour and the, the all-purpose flour and unbleached flour. Just a minute, I've got to close this oven door. This place is heating up with it open. There. All-purpose flour is a blend of hard and soft wheat flours. Unbleached flour has a creamy cast and is more nutritious than bleached flour. Let's dump out this biscuit dough. You see, if I had made 6 cups of flour, we really would have had a lot. Sometimes the big recipes intimidate beginning cooks. I happen to like big recipes because I like to have food stored in the freezer, but I realize that not everybody goes by that philosophy. Now get your hands floured up here and give this just a few kneads. If you're going to substitute unbleached flour for regular flour, you should use less unbleached flour. Use about 1 tablespoon per cup less of the unbleached. Now pat this out, if you like, or roll it out. I happen to like to roll it out to about 3/4 inch. I had a viewer write in and ask me where I got this rolling pin. Well, actually, I got it in Paris at a cooking supply store when I went over there to take, if you can believe, French cooking lessons at the Ritz. It was the hardest thing I ever did, and I called it a vacation. My friends were out shopping themselves. I was going to say silly, but that's not. Shopping themselves tired, while I was slaving over a stove and learning how to make puff paste. We're going to make heart-shaped biscuits today. You know, you just don't have to use a round cutter such as this, because that's sort of conventional. You can make biscuits almost in any shape if you're starting with a firm dough. Sometimes I use this shape. It's flour, and I think flower shape, and I think it's rather pretty. At Christmas time, I use a bell, but as you see today, I'm going to use this heart-shaped form. See how nicely those hold together? This is really a good dough. The biscuits can be baked at this point, but one of the great things about this recipe is that you can freeze them instead of baking, and then bake them as you need them. What you would do would be to put this whole tray in the deep freeze until they're hard. Overnight's fine. Then the next day, transfer it all, the contents, to a plastic sack and store it in the freezer, and then just draw them out as you need them to use. Now you see, these have been frozen and they're thawing just a little bit. But I want to give you the time temperatures for the 2 different kinds. For these dear little biscuits that have just been made, you would bake them at 400 degrees for 13 to 15 minutes. If you are baking the solid frozen ones and you don't want to thaw them, you would bake them for 15 to 18 minutes. Now the baking time is going to vary from oven to oven. It's very hard to be precise because my oven is different than your oven. And that's some of the maddening impreciseness of cooking that challenges us all. Here's what they look like when they're all finished. Isn't that pretty? Serve them piping hot with your favorite homemade jam. This is my grandmother's Victorian cake dish. We have a lot of Victorian things in the Midwest. And if an Amish lady had a little extra money in her pocket from her quilting, she might be inclined to buy one of these at a flea market, take it home, clean it up, and put it in her living room cupboard with her very best dishes. You know, bread making is really for those who love to work with their hands. Some cooks derive great pleasure from the feel and the fragrance of the dough as it's kneaded and formed. The art of bread making and baking can be a very satisfying hobby, for there's always something to be learned. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you how to make a very old-fashioned Amish buttermilk bread that's out of this world. But before I do that, I thought you might like to see firsthand how bread is made at a small Mennonite bakery in Indiana. This Mennonite bakery is an offshoot of a restaurant and bed and breakfast operation. Their baked goods were so good that the customers wanted to buy them to take them home. The kneading is done mostly with a dough hook and then finished up by hand. Making the bread in small batches gives it an old-fashioned texture and flavor. This is really a small amount of bread for a commercial bakery to make, but it's these small amounts that account for its goodness. By patting out the dough firmly, using your knuckles and palms, the air bubbles are worked out, and that is important. If you don't do it, you'll have big holes in your finished product, and you don't want that. She forms the loaf in her own individual way that I'd not seen before, which is perfectly all right. The object is to have a smooth roll, large air bubbles all pressed out, with all the ends tucked in firmly so it rises in a smooth, unseamed mass. I took a lot of real teasing because my roll certainly didn't look like hers, and I told her I'd have to buy it after it was baked. No one else would want it. They make several kinds of bread here: white, cracked wheat, raisin, and an apple bread that you die for. These breads are served in thick slices and often with homemade apple butter. The dough has to rise, and that is done in a warmer. The loaves continue to rise a bit in the oven as they bake. That's called a spring rise. You can almost smell the fragrance of that bread, can't you? Because bread is baked every day, and these bakers are quite professional, with the exception of me, of course, there is no indecision on their part if the bread is baked enough. At home, you could use an instant meat thermometer. Insert it in the bread that's baking in the oven, and if it registers 200 degrees, it's done. These Amish girls bake 5,000 loaves of bread a week during their busy summer season. They do put in long hours. Remove the loaves from the pans to cool always. If this isn't done, the bread steams and you'll have soggy bread. Brushing the tops of the bread with butter gives it a final homemade touch. The ability to make good bread has become a status symbol of sorts. It does take a bit of practice just to get the feel of it, but not much. Once making bread is felt, it's never forgotten. The recipe for buttermilk bread starts this way. You combine a package of yeast and 1/4 cup of warm water and a tablespoon of molasses together. The idea here is quite simply to dissolve the yeast in the water, because I'm using the dried kind. We add the tablespoon of molasses to give the yeast something to feed upon. The function of the yeast is not only to push the dough up, but to also develop flavor and texture in the bread. Yeast feeds and multiplies on the starch in the flour. Here we have the proofed yeast, and that means it has been standing for about 10 minutes. And notice the difference. It's extremely puffy, and it looked like that in the beginning. On the stove, we have 2 cups of buttermilk that's lukewarm, and to that, we're going to add another tablespoon of this tangy molasses and a teaspoon and a half of salt, and 2 tablespoons of bacon fat. Now, I know that you're horrified to think that I am adding bacon fat, but remember, I told you earlier it only has 1/2 of the saturated fat that butter does. And it gives you a great, great flavor. Then mix this up, and the lukewarm liquid is going to further assure you that this is going to raise quickly and nicely. If you get this too hot, incidentally, it will kill your yeast, so make sure it's just lukewarm. In my KitchenAid bowl, I have 3 cups of unbleached flour, and I'm going to add first the lukewarm mixture to that. Then just beat that up nicely. Then we're going to add all this proofed yeast. I think I better scrape that out because we want every bit of that in there, or this won't rise properly. There you can see that the molasses is settled to the bottom, so that's important that we got that in there. And whoops, well, my usual abandon in the kitchen. The recipe calls for approximately 5.5 to 6.5 cups of flour. The only way I can tell you that you can do this is by your feeling the dough, and add this 1 cup at a time to this batter. I'm going to start, let me see, this would be 4.5 cups, and we're going to lock it. Yeast products, bread doughs, are very imprecise because the amount of flour used depends on things like, I regret to tell you, how much rainfall that this wheat had out in the field, how much moisture is in your room. And now we're going to add another cup. Actually, making yeast breads is sort of like living with your spouse. You never know exactly how they're going to react. But like your spouse, yeast breads are also pretty forgiving stuff. I think this needs just a little bit more flour here. And then we're going to knead it. That looks good to me. And I'm going to need a little bit more flour into this. This could be kneaded 2 ways. I could knead it on the board, which I'm going to do because that way I can actually control the flour, the amount of flour I'm going to put in it. Or I could knead it by putting on this dough hook and letting it do the work like this. Not quite that heavy. And at home, I would probably do that. And one warning, as I work around in the kitchen while this is kneading away, this thing might vibrate off of your kitchen counter, so set it way back because that would be a mess you don't even want to contemplate. Now we're going to knead this by hand, and I want to show you the technique. Flour your hands well, as I did, and then start kneading. Now kneading is quite simply this: quarter turns and pressing it out with your palms. You should knead this anywhere from 8 to 12 minutes. Your hands will tell you absolutely how long you ought to knead it, because when it gets bouncy, you know that it's pretty well finished. Then put this aside in a greased bowl and let it rise for an hour at least in a draft-free warm place. Now this is what it looks like when it's all done. Isn't it perfectly gorgeous? That little amount of dough just puffed up to this. Now, not only by the dough rising twice to its volume that it really started out with, you can also test the dough to see if it's risen as much as it should by indenting it with 2 fingers. And if the dent remains, the dough is ready for the next step. If the dent slowly fills in, it can rise a little bit longer. Now, at this point, you're going to punch this down and punch it down thoroughly. Be emphatic. You don't want any air bubbles in there. And then turn it out on your board. And I'm running short here, so I've really got to hustle. Then cut this, do a few more turns kneading to get out the big air bubbles, and cut it in half. And then either roll or pat it out to the width of this pan. Now, ordinarily, I would roll that out, but I'm rushing, as you can see. Bring 1/3 over it this way, pound it in, bring this over this way, and tuck in the edges so no seams show, and put it in your greased pan. Let it rise for an hour. It looks like this after an hour. Then bake it at 425 degrees for 10 minutes, 350 for 25, and believe it or not, you end up with this gorgeous, gorgeous bread. It's an immensely gratifying recipe to make. This particular loaf has a very mellow flavor with its touch of molasses and bacon fat. Let's review what we did today. German onion cake, really a soft, delicious, enormous biscuit topped with sauteed onions, poppy seeds, and sour cream. Blissful experience just to put it in your mouth. Old-fashioned Amish dressing, worth crossing the country for. It's practically a one-dish meal. And winsome, heart-shaped biscuits. Not only attractive, but very practical to make because you freeze the unbaked biscuits. And last but not least is this sublime buttermilk bread, nuanced with molasses and bacon. So today when I say esse gut, I really mean esse gut.
All recipes seen in this series are available in Marcia Adams' book, Cooking from Quilt Country. This hardcover contains nearly 200 Amish and Mennonite recipes with color photographs and descriptions of the food and folkways of America's heartland. The cost of the book is $24.95 plus handling. Please have your credit card ready when you call 1-800-325-2667. Series 2 of Amish Cooking from Quilt Country is available on home video for $59.95 plus shipping. All 13 programs in this second series are compiled on 3 VHS cassettes. Call 1-800-325-2667 for credit card orders.
Funding for Amish Cooking from Quilt Country was provided by Marcia Industries, America's cabinet maker, committed to quality and a variety of kitchen and bath cabinetry styles, and by